Greetings, folks. My name is Jess Tiergan, and this is Kendinos. She's going to help me record a video today. This video is going to be for week 7 of Culture of Psychology for Aspen University. In this video, I'm going to primarily address 4 different topics. The first of these topics is personality. The second is the 5-factor model in regards to personality. I don't know what the dog is doing today. The third topic is going to be internal versus external locus of control. And the fourth topic is going to be personality in relationship to cultural differences. So to start out, when we're talking about personality, we're talking about those stable traits that kind of define a person. So those traits that people often first have when they're pretty young. Traits that show up when people are babies, perhaps even, or definitely infanthood. And then we start seeing a lot of those personality traits show up even stronger as they become toddlers. Defining personality can be really complicated because it is made up of a huge mixture of these unique expressions and these characteristics that people possess. But we recognize personality as the things that are fairly stable. So personality is one of those things that, like I said, we can see elements of from very early on in a person's life and that stay pretty stable throughout their entire life until the point when they're elderly. We might see different presentations or different ways that the personality traits show up in different seasons in a person's life, but generally the personality trait itself will be pretty consistent. Another just interesting thing to note when we're considering personality is this whole concept in psychology of nature versus nurture. Where did traits come from? And personality is not something that environment creates. It's generally considered to be something that was formed genetically. Something that the parts that someone's just hardwired with. With that being said, though, personality impacts how a child is raised. So children with different personality types are generally raised differently, even by the same parents, because the way the child shows up in the world impacts how the parent shows up in their interactions with that child. Also, the way that a child is raised impacts how their personality is expressed. So 2 kids with the same personality, one that is raised in a far more permissive environment and one that is raised in a far more structured environment with the same personality, we're going to see a lot of different traits. The way the traits show up, the traits are the same, but the way those traits are expressed or show up is going to be vastly different for these two kids. So ultimately, personality can't be created or destroyed by the environment, but the way that it is expressed will dramatically impact the environment, and the environment will dramatically impact those traits. Moving on to dig a little bit deeper into personality, one model of personality studying is called the 5-factor model. And the 5-factor model has been shown to be pertinent across a lot of different cultures and within and throughout cultures. And so it's been shown that it isn't just a model that works for a very limited number of people, but instead these 5 personality traits are personality traits that seem to be pretty consistent across multiple different ethnic groups, cultural groups, etc. With these 5 different traits, there's a couple different ways that they're generally scored. Sometimes people will be scored on them as like high, central, or medium, and low. It's also pretty common for people to be scored on a scale, like on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being very low on the scale and 5 being very high on the scale. Anyway, so these 5 traits in the 5-factor model are neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And so just a brief overview of what these characteristics are. Neuroticism is an expression of high emotionality. Neuroticism is often folks that might be perceived as sensitive to the environment or moody, folks that notice things quickly in the world, notice something that feels like it's off. These folks might be anxious. They might notice anything that's a little bit changing, anything that shifts a little bit. Those would be folks that would score high on the neuroticism of the personality traits. Extroversion is this folks that are often really outgoing, really assertive, maybe really active, like they want to move a lot, they want to talk a lot. They might be people that are really high excitement seekers, adrenaline seekers, movement seekers. And so folks like that would be ones that would score really high on the extroversion scale. The third one is openness. Folks that score high on the openness scale tend to be able to engage with things like fantasy. They like new things. They like concepts. They like values. They like ideas. They tend to not play inside of a small box. They tend to be unconventional. They tend to be able to imagine things. Imagine what is possible. They're very open, as the name would suggest. The fourth factor is agreeableness. Folks that score high on the agreeableness scale tend to be very compliant. They tend to trust people easily. They tend to earn people's trust easily. They tend to be very kind. They tend to be very modest. They're not seeking to have attention be on them. They'd rather somebody else take credit for a lot of things. They just want to get things done, and they want folks to like them. They want things to go smoothly for them. And the fifth one is conscientiousness. And folks that score high on the conscientiousness scale, apparently I have a hard time saying that, scale, really appreciate order. They view themselves as having a high duty. They're very disciplined. They're very predictable. They want to do things right. They want to do it in a very set, orderly manner. And so as we're studying personality, we have the opportunity to understand some about our own personality and about others' personalities through using that scale, because it is fairly consistent. And none of those personality traits are intrinsically good or intrinsically bad. They're just different. And we get to learn things about them, about ourselves, and learn things about those that we have the opportunity to lead or support. The next topic I want to go over real quickly is this idea of locus of control. And locus of control is where we feel like the power lies. So there's two different forms of locus of control. There's internal locus of control or external locus of control. And I would also throw out there that I feel like internal versus external locus of control is also on a spectrum. Like, it's not like someone's all internal locus and or all external locus of control, but most of us are somewhere on a spectrum in between. So I would be really intrigued to see if we could use more of a percentage, like someone who's 50% is half and half of both. But anyway, so this idea of like where the power lies. So someone with a high internal locus of control tends to view self as very responsible. So they might think if something goes wrong, it's their fault. If something goes right, it's their fault. On the flip side, someone with a high internal locus of control also feels like they are very capable of changing the outcome. So if they don't like the way something's going, they often feel like they're very capable of shifting it. These are the types of people that are often very driven in a business world, because they feel like they can create the career they want, they can create the life they want. They can sometimes seem kind of pushy, sometimes they can seem very confident. Also, on the flip side, sometimes these folks can seem overwhelmed because they feel like they are responsible for all the things, and they can take on responsibility that they're not actually responsible for. Cultures that really value independence, the like lone wolf type of cultures, often really place a high respect or hold the internal locus of control in really high regard. For those with a really high external locus of control, they tend to view fate or others or circumstance as more powerful than themselves. So if something goes wrong, goes bad with a project or something, they might say, oh, I mean, it just happens, or, the team didn't work hard enough. But also if something goes right, they might be quick to say, yeah, the whole team worked really hard, or, fate was just in our favor today. And so they oftentimes don't feel as if they have as much control. So they might not seem as driven or as focused. They might rely more on external influences to provide them the motivation they need to create the world that they want to see. Cultures that value more of a group mentality, cultures that are more collectivist in nature, often value this external locus of control because it focuses more on the group, focuses more on the us than the I. And so this is a cultural difference that we can see. On that note, moving on to the last topic of personality and cultural differences, like I mentioned earlier, personality is often genetic in nature, or perhaps it's completely genetic in nature. That's an arguable point. But with that being said, many cultures have different personalities as their norm because of the genetic components. And so we'll see entire groups of people, entire culture groups that tend to have different personality norms. And even with folks with different personalities inside of those cultural norms, culture helps shape how the personality traits show up and direct some of the traits, encourage or discourage some of those traits. And so that impacts how we see these traits show up in regards to culture. We also see that different cultures reward or encourage different personality traits in regards to what we highly regard. So if you're in part of a culture that highly encourages or holds in high regard personality traits like extroversion, you'll see folks that really appreciate musicians and artists and performers. And you'll see those personality traits as being held very high in those cultures. And maybe folks that tend to be more shy or maybe tend to be more conscientious, more introverted or conscientious, not be viewed as highly. Not because there's anything wrong with their personality, but just because of the cultural differences. So if there's someone who's extroverted in a culture that really values extroversion, you might see them push harder into that extroversion because it's highly rewarded. If you see someone that's part of a more introverted culture that's more extroverted, you might see them rein themselves back and hold themselves try to limit themselves or be more quiet or find ways to decrease some of that extroversion if they're part of a culture that values more of a quiet and a less rowdy type of presentation. All right, so I think that's going to be the end of our presentation today. So in conclusion, we talked about personality traits, the 5-factor model, internal versus external locus of control, and some ways that cultural differences show up with personality. Thank you for listening to this video. I look forward to seeing you all soon. Peace.